And now it's time for our weekend recap. So let's get right into it. We're going to start off with the heavyweight fight between Gerald Washington and Adam Kownacki. Now, I will say that I did pick the winner in the fight, but the fight itself didn't play out as I expected. I expected that Adam Kownacki, given that he's so aggressive, he has such a high work rate, very respectable power, that his style, coupled with Gerald Washington's style, which up until this point was using movement, using his mobility, using his athleticism to keep a guy at the long end of the jab, the far end of the jab, I figured that when you put those two things together, what you're going to get is a situation where Kownacki is doing most of the work, thus winning most of the rounds, so likelier than not, he's going to win a decision. And this thing never made it to the cards. This thing didn't even make it to the halfway point of the fight. From the opening bell, you could see that this was one hell of a round. And to my surprise, you know, there were spots in that first round, because the fight didn't last very long, so there really isn't that much to mull over. But in moments of that first round, we saw Gerald Washington giving up his height. We saw Gerald Washington trying to mix it up with Kownacki on the inside, and that's the reason I think the fight ended as soon as it did. That's the reason I think Adam Kownacki was able to inflict so much damage so quickly to Gerald Washington. That had Gerald Washington kept more space between himself and Kownacki, who's the smaller guy, if he kept more space between them, he wouldn't have been able to land those big shots, those telling blows. He wouldn't have had the chance, or at least at minimum, you would have took something off of his work rate. That, yes, you know, shots are getting through, but you're offsetting some of those shots by keeping space between you and him. And then doing so, that'll buy you time. That will allow you to survive, to hang in there, to, at minimum, stay in the fight and finish the fight on your feet.
Not on your ass.
You know, Kownacki scored one hell of a knockdown in this fight, and I thought it was over after that knockdown. I really thought it was over, because you could see that Gerald Washington's equilibrium was compromised. You could see that he was visibly off balance, but the ref, you know, he let it go on, and then a little after that, he stops it, because Gerald Washington, you know, he's not showing nothing. And what Adam Kownacki showed in this fight, his virtues, what's going to resonate with people, because there's going to be a few things that resonate with people about this fight, is he showed an ability to contend with a fighter that's bigger than he is, that may have the appearance of being more athletic than he is, but still landing very good combinations, telling blows, being able to impose his will on another guy who, at least, you know, from a purely aesthetic perspective, might seem like the better athlete, but in reality is not, because Gerald Washington is in no way, shape, or form the puncher that Kownacki is, and he in no way, shape, or form has the work rate that Kownacki has. You know, I say it all the time about Kownacki and even Andy Ruiz, that these guys have very innocuous, unassuming demeanors. You know, that these guys, you wouldn't look at these guys and think they could fight as good as they do. But Adam Kownacki, Andy Ruiz also, those guys are killers, man. They're killers. They might not look like killers, but that's what they are. And I think what's going to resonate with people after this, you know, not just that Adam Kownacki won in spectacular fashion, but that he won in spectacular fashion against a familiar face. Remember, this is the same Gerald Washington that was outboxing Deontay Wilder. With his movement, with his jab, he was giving the WBC heavyweight champion a lot of problems. And yet he wasn't able to give those same problems to Adam Kownacki. Now understand that that is not a triangle theory. I'm not insinuating that because Kownacki beat Washington in better fashion than Wilder did, that would have to mean that Kownacki beats Wilder. That's not what I'm saying.
Nah.
What I'm saying is, when people walk away from this fight and they take stock of who Adam Kownacki is and what he's capable of, they'll be reminded that he just took out a familiar face and he did it relatively quickly. And that is worth some anecdotal value. That at minimum, you're becoming aware of the level at which he operates. That he is beginning to come into his own, to make a name for himself, to climb up those top 10 heavyweight rankings and establish himself as one of the most dangerous guys in the weight class. Because he, like others, like Jarrell Miller, like Deontay Wilder, guys who are in the top 10 rankings of the heavyweight division itself, that he, like them, dispatched Gerald Washington in good fashion. He did it relatively easy. So he, much like them, might just be a top 10 heavyweight. That's what we're finding out. That's what I think last night's performance communicated to the boxing fans. So congratulations to Adam Kownacki for a stellar show. And if you're going to put a guy out, that'd be the way to do it. And, you know, I look forward to seeing more of him.
In the near future.
Next up, let's talk about the Jaime Munguia versus Kownacki-Inoue fight. Now, this was a fight that I thought was going to end in a stoppage or a knockout. This is a fight that I thought was going to end, you know, with somebody being put on their ass. It's funny because I thought the Kownacki fight was going to go to the cards, and I thought that this fight would end in a knockout. It was the opposite. I picked Munguia to win the fight, but I'm going to tell you something. Takeshi Inoue gave a hell of a performance, and I think people need to pay attention to that this guy showed great resolve, great persistence, and punch resistance.
Round by round.
That even though Jaime Munguia had a visible size advantage, and Jaime Munguia is a young guy, he's a champion who packs quite a wallop, he's a pressure fighter. Takeshi Inoue was able to effectively pressure the pressure guy, so much so that he was backing Munguia off. Let's talk about the fight. You know, Takeshi Inoue's strategy for Jaime Munguia, it wasn't the hardest strategy to understand. You know, it was simple enough. It's just not that simple to work around. That Takeshi Inoue was, you know, coming forward with that peekaboo defense and trying to smother Jaime Munguia's work rate. Now, you may be asking yourself, why? What's that supposed to do? Well, if he smothers Jaime Munguia's work rate, if he's right up on him,
in a phone booth,
crowding him, not giving him any kind of space, that takes away Jaime Munguia's ability to generate power. You know, if you're the smaller guy, fat chance of you winning the fight, fighting the fight from the outside. Your best bet if you're the smaller guy is to crowd the bigger guy. Get all in his chest. Rough him up, you know, push him around.
Make him uncomfortable.
That's your best bet, and I think that Takeshi Inoue and his team, they knew that because that was their preferred methodology throughout the course of the fight.
Make him uncomfortable.
Now, in defense of Jaime Munguia, even though in spots in this fight it was working for Inoue,
Munguia battled back.
Jaime Munguia was still able to work around these things. Jaime Munguia actually showed growth. I know a lot of people might have different interpretations of a performance like this, but what I saw from Jaime Munguia was growth. I saw a level, not a high level, but still a level of versatility. That where normally Jaime Munguia is the bully in the ring, he is the bigger guy, he's accustomed to pushing guys around and imposing his will upon them, pressuring those guys. I saw movement from Jaime Munguia. I saw a jab. I saw his ability to
use the ring,
work on the go,
and hang in there.
That as Takeshi Inoue is trying to pressure him and trying to crowd him,
Munguia's still in
Munguia's still landing the more telling blows. He's still landing the cleaner, clearer, sharper punches in the eyes of the judges. That even though Takeshi Inoue is giving him that much more pressure to have to work around, that's not stopping Munguia from landing bombs. It's making it a little harder for him to get off those bombs, but all the same, he is still getting them off. That as Takeshi Inoue is coming forward and trying to crowd Jaime is making him pay for it. Each time, you know, he's ripping shots upstairs and shots downstairs. He's drilling Takeshi Inoue's midsection. And, you know, it's a wonder that Takeshi Inoue was able to absorb that much punishment downstairs and maintain that pace. The only thing you can chalk that up to is conditioning, being that much of a good athlete, because most other guys would have folded right the fuck up had they had to absorb that many strong shots to the midsection from a guy as big as Munguia at junior middleweight. And he was firing these shots from optimal position. That's saying that there was enough space for that punch to travel and gain momentum and gain velocity and connect with the other guy's midsection. And yet, Takeshi Inoue was able to take it. I think it was a good showing for both guys. To be quite honest, both of those guys put a lot of things on display last night. You know, Jaime Munguia is showing growth. I'm not sure that some of you guys might agree with that, but the way I'm looking at it is, after a physically arduous fight like that, where the guy actually gave you something to have to work around, not a showcase fight, not a fight that's intended to fool the boxing public into making them thinking that you're better than what you are. When you have to actually deal with adversity, and you're as young as Jaime Munguia, that makes you that much better down the line. That makes you more and more of a clutch kind of fighter, a fighter who's had hard experiences. Thus, as you go progressing fight by fight, it makes you that better for it, because iron sharpens iron. You learn more from the situation when the guy's giving you something to have to work around, as opposed to a guy who's basically just there to lay down. He's there for a check. You're not going to walk away from that situation learning how to do anything. But in a fight like this, it tests your resolve, it tests your toughness, it tests your ability to work around uncomfortable situations, so that if you ever find yourself in a situation like this again, you'll know what to do, because you'll have a point of reference. You know what worked, what didn't work, and what you need to do to win that fight. So I think that this was very beneficial to Jaime Munguia. You know, it's not just a title defense. It's not just a way for him to pick up fans in Houston. It's also a learning experience. And I think, from this learning experience, some things that Jaime may need to work on. Just one man's opinion, feel free to disagree. But defense is still his weakness. His defensive prowess is still an area of weakness for the WBO junior middleweight champion. That even when these guys are mixing it up in the phone booth and they're, you know, they're deep in the pocket or they're in the clinch, there was some looping rights that were getting through for Takeshi Inoue. And Jaime Munguia, he really can't afford to get hit like that, you know, not even in the clinch, not even in the phone booth. That, you know, he needs to do what he can to tie up that other arm to make sure those shots aren't getting through. And if they do get through, try to roll those shots as best as he can from that position, because some of those shots actually had some mustard on them. just as well. We saw in the fight that Munguia was being forced back, and he was firing the jab as a deterrent, but he was firing it off at the same intensity. Essentially, Jaime fired every shot like it was a power shot, and constantly doing that comes at the expenditure of your energy reserves. So late into the fight, you don't got quite the pop, quite the mustard, quite the snap in your punches to really hurt the guy. So, one thing he can do, just one man's opinion, is to fire that same jab at a different intensity. They don't all need to be power shots. You can use that jab as a decoy. It doesn't even have to be a real quick 1-2 so much as a decoy to get the guy looking in that direction and then hit him with something that he doesn't see. So, I think that this was a good learning experience for Jaime Munguia. He showed many of the virtues that we've become accustomed to seeing with him, and we even saw a bit of improvement. So, it was a very entertaining fight. I expected it to be an entertaining fight, but I did expect it to end much sooner than this. I had Munguia winning this fight in the first quarter of the fight, and that's not what happened. Takeshi-Inoue, he really came to fight, and that's another guy you want to keep your eye on in the junior middleweight division. But all things considered, it was a good showing. I picked Munguia to win. That's what he did. Not in the fashion that I thought he would, but all the same, Munguia has retained his WBO title. And finally, what is last night's performance that I think most people are thinking about and talking about this morning? Keith Thurman's comeback fight against Josecito Lopez, his defense of the WBA welterweight title. And, it's very obvious that ring rust showed up in the fight. It's very obvious like that. That goes without saying that Keith Thurman, for the most part, had full control of the first half of the fight. But leading into the second half of the fight, around the 7th, he was in big trouble. Eating some big shots, his legs, they didn't appear to be there. His punch resistance, his energy reserves, all those things that he showed in the first half of the fight, they looked spent. They looked sapped. And you can attribute that to ring rust, that this is a guy who hasn't had to swap punches with anybody and hasn't had to defend himself from punches against anybody for about a year. Well, about 2 years.
2 years.
So even though Josecito Lopez is the kind of guy that if you put him in there with Crawford would likely beat him handily like he beats everybody else. If you put him in there with Errol Spence would beat him handily, same way he beats everybody else handily. That if you put this same Josecito Lopez that greatly troubled Keith Thurman in what was his comeback fight, if you put that same guy in there with those guys, they would dispatch him. Whereas Keith went life or death with him. And that reveals the level at which Keith Thurman is currently operating. I talked to a lot of guys leading up to this comeback fight, guys saying that, Keith Thurman is really the #1 of the weight class. And to those guys I said, we don't know that Keith Thurman is at the level that he used to be. He's got to come back and show us what kind of fighter he is, what level he's at today to prove that. And I think that, it goes without saying that I was right. Last night's Keith Thurman would lose to Terrence Crawford, would lose to Errol Spence, probably lose a rematch to Sean Porter, and probably lose to Danny Garcia. If that Keith Thurman showed up to fight those guys last night as opposed to who he actually fought, they would have beat him, because Josecito looked like he came pretty close. So if Josecito can do that, just imagine what the upper echelon guys can do. The top tier guys. The guys that not only have belts, but the other guys who make up the elite of the weight class. Essentially, Keith Thurman showed last night that he is not operating at the level at which he used to 2 years ago. And he needs more than just a tune-up fight to get back to where he was at, if he can get back at all. Beginning of the fight, the punches are snappy, they've got some mustard on them. Keith even scores a knockdown. The movements, they're sharp, they're fresh. He's effectively negating Josecito Lopez's advancing attacks by, angling his upper body and staying on his bike, taking a small step back as Josecito comes forward, then
countering him,
launching counter shots. This is something that he was afforded at the time that he was fresh in the fight. But as the fight is wearing on, and his energy reserves are being sapped by his constant movement around the ring, his defense isn't as good as it was. And that's letting you know what Keith Thurman's defensive prowess hinges on. That it hinges more on athleticism and mobility than technique. That he's not standing there in the pocket, picking off shots, catching and shooting.
He moves around.
That Keith Thurman's particular brand of defense comes at a great expenditure of his energy reserves, and it being that you're not just going to pick up where you left off
2 years ago.
And since so much of your defensive prowess hinges on physicalities and physical attributes, as your energy reserves wane, so does your defense. You got to realize something. A lot of these guys got similar tactics. A lot of these guys employ similar strategies, but their signatures are different. Keith Thurman's signature, his brand of defensive prowess, is reliant more on athleticism, movement, reflexes than skill. And these are broad strokes. These are not subtleties. You can visibly see that Keith Thurman's way of getting out of trouble is to get on his bike and move around the ring, angling his upper body. Very big movements, very broad strokes. And those broad strokes are coming at the cost of his energy because they are physicalities. They rely on his physical attributes more than anything else. Whereas with another fighter who might be a little bit more subtle, they might opt to, stay in the pocket, maintain that position so that they're in optimal position to fire a counter shot. They may opt to do something that's a little bit more subtle and doesn't come at the cost of their energy, like, blocking the shots with your gloves or your arms. Making a smaller, more subtle movement, to angle yourself away from a punch and fire back very quickly. In other words, another guy doesn't rely on his physical attributes as much as Keith does to compensate as defense or a form of defense, whereas Keith does. And when you've been out of the ring for 2 years moving around that much, that's going to get you tired. So your defense is going to suffer for it. That's essentially what we saw. Now, I don't want to just disparage Keith Thurman and just write him off. I'm just saying that last night's Keith Thurman would have lost to Crawford, would have lost to Spence, would have lost to Porter, would have lost to Garcia. Last night's Keith Thurman, the one we saw last night, he would have lost to those guys, and that indicates that he's got more work to do, that he may need another tune-up before he's ready to walk into a unification or walk into a high-level situation. So in that way, as I said before, we don't know that Keith Thurman is just going to pick up where he left off and operate at the same level, and it appears that no, he hasn't. He's got more work to do. And in that way, don't expect this guy to swap punches with Errol Spence anytime soon. I mean, this is why he's basically put off that fight till the following year. But it's gotten to the point where you've put that off for so long that people are now impatient with you. They don't even want to hear what you got to say, and it doesn't help that you say so much, that you got all these different things to say, but at the end of the day, before you even took that hiatus, that fight was there. I'll tell you the truth that Keith showed championship-level resolve, resilience, and persistence. He managed to survive the fight. He managed to retain his title, and in that way, that is commendable. But at the same time, I feel like he's painted himself into a corner, and it's going to be very hard to get out of that corner. In the back of our minds, we all knew ahead of this fight that ring rust was a possibility, but I don't think that any of us expected Keith to struggle that much.